It was my privilege to present at this year's ASCO meeting on behalf of my co-investigators the results of the OPTIMISMM study. This was an international randomized Phase III trial evaluating the three-drug combination of Pomalidomide, Bortezomib and Dexamethasone compared to Bortezomib and Dexamethasone, which was considered an appropriate control in patients who had received 1 to 3 prior lines of therapy. Now, what was unique about this study and very important to share with the audience is that we wanted to specifically evaluate the role of this three-drug combination in patients who had received prior lenalidomide, and most importantly, given the recent approval of lenalidomide for upfront treatment and maintenance, this was a population that had not been comprehensively studied before. In similar Phase III trials in the 1 to 3 prior lines of therapy, the majority of patients actually had not received lenalidomide and certainly weren't necessarily len refractory. So for that reason, a particularly important study, and it also helped us define, or we hope to define, the position of pomalidomide in earlier relapse, recognizing that it's approved in late relapse. And the question is, how does it behave in early relapse? So the study enrolled 566 patients, very well balanced for risk factors, age, prior regimens and so forth. And what we saw was that in fact 70% of the patients were truly len refractory. The remaining 30% had all had len per protocol, but weren't refractory to it coming onto the study. Regardless of that, in all the subgroups that we evaluated, clinical benefit was seen for the 3 drugs over the 2. And what was most striking was that in those patients who'd had only 1 prior therapy, the progression-free survival benefit was quite remarkable at over 10 months, with a hazard ratio of 0.5. What was also very important to share is that in those patients who had had more than that number of lines of prior therapy, the clinical benefit continued, so that overall, the clinical benefit was around 4.5 months in favor of the 3 drugs versus the 2 in terms of progression-free survival benefit. When we looked at response rates, in the first line of prior therapy group, 90% of patients responded to the 3-drug combination, and in those overall, the response rate was around 82%, so a really good response rate as well. Excitingly, the tolerability profile was actually quite favorable. There were no unexpected side effects encountered, and whilst the rates of neutropenia were a little higher in the 3-drug combination versus the 2, the rates of febrile neutropenia were very low at just 3%. And there were no unexpected, or as I mentioned, non-manageable toxicities seen. For example, rates of thromboembolism were low in both arms of the study, and whilst rates of neuropathy were a little higher for the 3-drug combination versus the 2, again, this was generally manageable. And most importantly, there were no cardiac side effects seen in either arm, in fact, that would have been a concern. So overall, the study represents the first trial of its kind to look at this particular population. It establishes the 3-drug combination of pomalidomide, bortezomib and dexamethasone as a new standard of care in this particular group. And we hope, excitingly, it'll provide a platform for other combinations going forward where, for example, antibodies could be added to it as a very rational next step in its use.